Welcome to another episode of the podcast, Ask Holly. I am joined by Holly Salmon. She is CEO of the Better Business Bureau.
Yeah.
And we're going to start off our podcast with a viewer recommended question. So I'm going to read this. Where do you, Holly, most often see trouble, and when or how do most people get ripped off?
It's a pretty broad question, but there is kind of a singular vein to where we see the most trouble, how most people get themselves into trouble or get ripped off. And it is when consumers are, for one reason or another, at risk. Mm-hmm. And that could mean, let's start off with emotionally at risk. Mm-hmm. So there are two times in someone's life where there are extreme emotions. That's death and weddings. Mm. There are huge emotions, obviously, when someone has passed away. There are obviously huge emotions, often very crisis emergency type situations, and people make decisions and sign contracts that equate to thousands and thousands of dollars for burial expenses, arrangements, things like that. And oftentimes people have not done any sort of preparation, and so they're making decisions in a very stressful situation. So oftentimes we see people who may not necessarily fall victim per se to a scam or get ripped off so much as they may spend more money than they had expected to. They may choose a provider that later they're not quite happy with because they didn't take the time to do their homework. They didn't take the time to do some research. So especially when it comes to death and even with weddings, getting to weddings, big emotions, a lot of busyness, a lot of money being spent. So when you're making a decision on a photographer, when you're making a decision on a videographer, on a florist, on a bakery, these are all places where you're going to spend a lot of money. You want to make sure that you've done your homework. What have other people reported as their experience? Did they have a great experience? If they had complaints, how did the company handle it? Because oftentimes those can give you some sort of indication on how your experience might go. And so again, funerals and weddings, we see a lot of money being spent, and people very rarely do their homework.
You know, I've always wondered when you say, do your homework and check reviews, online reviews, how legitimate are those? I mean, are those planted and paid for, or do they typically tend to be the real deal?
What's interesting about that is you can get in some really big trouble if you get caught planting reviews and posting fake reviews. Better Business Bureau, I can only speak to what we do. Our customer reviews are vetted in the same way that we vet complaints. So when we receive a customer review, let's say a negative customer review, we send that customer review to the business, and they have the opportunity to respond. Okay. So they may say, this is not my customer. They may say, this is a disgruntled former employee. They may say, this is my competitor. And so they have that opportunity. And then we go back to the consumer and say, okay, here's what the company said. We're going to need you to substantiate this.
Right.
And if they never get back to us, or if they aren't able to provide that substantiation, that customer review is never posted.
Okay.
So we vet our customer reviews as stringently as we do our complaints, because we wanted to make sure that we do the best we can to make sure that the reviews that we provide to consumers out into the marketplace are as high quality as they possibly can be. But will you find fake reviews out there on other sites? Absolutely, you will. And I'm not saying that they don't slip through our fingers as well from time to time, but you want to make sure that you look at the entire body of information. You use all your resources to look in several different places. I'll give you an example. I looked at our customer reviews recently for a company, and then I looked at customer reviews on other sites, and there was a huge difference in the customer reviews. We had a lot of negative customer reviews reviews with an all very similar story. And the customer reviews I was finding elsewhere were all very glowing reviews. So you want to make sure that you kind of look around. Don't just, don't just go to bbb.org and stop there. Use all your resources and look around. When you're spending thousands of dollars and when you want this to be the happiest day of your life, or when you're have a funeral or those plans for a loved one, you want to make sure that you are not overspending. You want to make sure that the arrangements are carried out in the exact way that you planned and that you wanted them to be. It's just high emotion oftentimes equals trouble.
High emotion definitely puts a consumer at risk, but there are other factors as well. Language barriers. Perhaps if a consumer is in some financial difficulties, those also place a consumer at risk where they may not be making their best judgment calls.
Yeah, especially when consumers are at risk financially. If they are already in financial trouble and they are desperate, oftentimes we find that they will, grasp it at any hope. And so they may fall victim to things like, spending money to try to have their debt negotiated or spending money to have their debt settled, things like that. Obviously, payday loans are something that people will reach for when they're in desperate times, and they don't always fully understand what the potential risks there are and how much it could really cost them in the long run. So when someone is already in a stressful crisis situation and they're facing, they may not be able to pay their utilities or purchase food or very basic things, people get very desperate and oftentimes make very desperate decisions. And that's oftentimes when we see trouble.
So emergencies, that's another situation where you're forced to make very quick decisions under emotional duress.
Yep. And that would be hurricanes, storm damage. If you have a pipe burst in your home and all of a sudden you have tons of water damage in your home, that's an emergency situation. You get into a car accident, you have car damage, and you have to find a place to fix it, then choose a rental car company. These are all things that you never knew you needed to prepare for. And so when you are making decisions under the gun like that and in a really high stress situation, that is when we need you, or we want you, we encourage you to depend on your resources. Call Better Business Bureau. Let us help you. Call friends or family. Let them help you. They are going to be in a much more stable place than you are in the middle of your emergency. They may be able to help you make better, rational decisions. You want to make sure that, you don't sign contracts, pay deposits, write checks in the middle of a crisis if you can avoid it at all, because that is when we really see people not only fall victim to scams, but also make decisions that when the moment has passed, they regret.
Any other takeaway tips that you want to give consumers about how to stay smart out there in the marketplace?
Research is a great tool. We recommend that when you move into a home, or, regardless if it's an apartment, if you're owning or leasing, renting, that develop a list of your providers. Develop that list when you don't need them, when you're not stressed out and in a real emergency situation. If I needed roof repairs, who would I call? If I needed a tree removed, who would I call? If I needed a window repaired, who would I call? Things like that. You want to obviously check off the list. Electrical and water too. I need a plumber. I need an electrician. Choose those people before you need them, so that you have a chance to check their licensing, check their complaint history, check with Better Business Bureau to see what have other consumers experienced with this company. Because doing your homework when you don't actually need them, you can make a much more rational, quality decision.
That's great advice. Creating your own provider list that has been vetted under, the coolness of mind instead of the craziness of emotion.
Yeah, and also give yourself some backup. backups.
Yeah.
So let's say if for some odd reason you had a home repair that immediately needed to take place, whether it was because of storm damage or you had a pipe burst or something like that, you want to make sure you've given yourself a backup. If for some odd reason my first choice isn't available, give yourself a backup. So when you're doing your homework, if you have two companies that you really like the looks of and you've checked them out, you feel good about them, put them both on your list so that when the time comes, you can just grab that. Have it on your phone, that's fine, but also have a physical backup paper copy so that you know where to grab it, so that when you're in the middle of the crisis, you don't have to make that amount of that's an important decision.
Yes.
It could be thousands of dollars. Don't put that added stress on yourself if you don't have to.
Well, that's some great advice. So thank you so much, Holly. We do want to point out that if you have any questions or any suggestions for future episodes of Ask Holly, send her an email at askholly@wkmg.com, and be sure to check back at Click Orlando regularly for more valuable consumer information and more episodes of Ask Holly, the podcast.
Thank you.